The honourable member for Beaches, East York.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to stand up and speak for a second time to S-9, and I would like, in fact, to pick up where my colleague from St. John's East actually left off, talking about where this bill comes from, and it emanates, of course, from the Senate. That's the nomenclature S. And for 7 years, Mr. Speaker, this government, this same Prime Minister, has been promising Senate reform. And he claims to have an issue with the fact that the chamber is unelected and unaccountable, and yet all the while dragging his feet, dragging the puck on this for 7 years. And in that time, he's led 58, Mr. Speaker, of his friends to comfortable seats in the Senate at extraordinary expense to the taxpayers of this country. And Mr. Speaker, that's the same old conduct that's been practiced in this place by both Liberal and Conservative governments since Confederation, and it's cynical politics, and is breeding a deep concern about our political system in those who can still bear to cast a gaze upon this place and the spectacle that it's become. And it's a particularly sad day today, Mr. Speaker, waking up to the realization that just last night the entrenched interests in this place and in the Senate, those interested in retaining the status quo, Conservatives and the Liberals, not just let slip by an opportunity, but actually stood on their feet to defeat an opportunity for change. A motion from my NDP colleague from Toronto, Danforth, to usher in real change, to begin a discussion about expunging from our political system unelected, unaccountable power in the hope of bringing really a deeper democracy to Canada, one befitting of a modern, hopeful country. And instead, we have the party of so-called reform allowing an important bill like S-9 to actually emanate from that unaccountable chamber. So suffice it to say that I'm disappointed that this important legislation honoring Canada's commitment to cooperate with the rest of the international community in protecting nuclear material and combating nuclear terrorism should have come from the Senate chamber instead of our own. Because Bill S-9, also known as the Nuclear Terrorism Act, will, when implemented, amend the criminal code to comply with Canada's international obligations with respect to two treaties: the Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material and the International Convention for the Suppression of Acts of Nuclear Terrorism. My NDP colleagues and I support this bill in the spirit of forging ahead with Canada's fulfillment of these international obligations and commitments. The Convention on Physical Protection of Nuclear Material, or CPPNM, dates back to 1980, Mr. Speaker, and is deposited with the International Atomic Energy Agency. To quote the IAEA, it is, quote, the only international legally binding undertaking in the area of physical protection of nuclear material. It establishes measures related to the prevention, detection, and punishment of offenses relating to nuclear material. Now, Canada is a signatory and had ratified the convention by the time it entered into force in 1987. The CPPNM was amended in 2005 to strengthen the provisions of the convention. Now, the 2005 version seeks to extend protection measures to nuclear facilities, in addition to protecting against the proliferation of nuclear materials. As well, it reinforces Canada's obligation under the UN Security Council Resolution 1540, passed in 2004, to enforce measures seeking to prevent the proliferation of such materials. It is the strengthened requirements of this amendment that Bill S-9 seeks to fulfill in clearing the way for Canada's ratification of the strengthened agreement, Mr. Speaker. Now, the second treaty, addressed within the provisions of Bill S-9, is the International Convention for the Suppression of Acts of Nuclear Terrorism, or ICSANT. This is an agreement that falls under the auspices of the United Nations and dates back to 2005 as well. And this convention deals more specifically with the issue of nuclear terrorism and calls on its signatories to establish criminal offenses within their national laws for acts of nuclear terrorism, and also introduces mandatory prosecution or extradition of offenders. Mr. Speaker, Bill S-9 will amend the criminal code to include 4 new offences that relate to nuclear terrorism and thus fulfill Canada's obligation under the above-mentioned conventions. These new offences will make it illegal to possess, use, or dispose of nuclear or radioactive material or a nuclear or radioactive device or commit an act against a nuclear facility or its operations with the intent to cause death, serious bodily harm, or substantial damage to property or the environment, to use or alter nuclear or radioactive material or a nuclear or radioactive device, or commit an act against a nuclear facility or its operation with the intent to compel a person, government, or international organization to do or refrain from doing anything, to commit an indictable offense under federal law for the purpose of obtaining nuclear radioactive material, a nuclear radioactive device, or access or control of a nuclear facility, and finally to threaten or commit to do any of the above. Now, in addition to those 4 offenses outlined above, the bill amends the criminal code to allow for the prosecution in Canada of individuals who have committed or attempted to commit these offenses outside of Canada. It also amends the double jeopardy rule so that the person can be tried within Canada for an offense that he or she has previously been convicted of by a foreign court in the event that that foreign trial didn't meet the certain basic Canadian legal standards. And it makes amendments to wiretap provisions and makes the new offenses primarily designated offenses for the purpose of DNA warrants and collection orders. So both the Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material and the Second Convention outline, Mr. Speaker, in plain language, the urgency of action. The CPPNM states that, and I quote, "Offenses relating to nuclear material and nuclear facilities are a matter of grave concern, and that there is an urgent need to adopt appropriate and effective measures or to strengthen existing measures to ensure the prevention, detection, and punishment of such offenses." While the ICSANT speaks of, quote, "the urgent, Mr. Speaker, need to enhance international cooperation between states in devising and adopting effective and practical measures for the prevention of such acts of terrorism and for the prosecution and punishment of their perpetrators," end quote. This sense of urgency, Mr. Speaker, was underscored in 2010 and again in 2012 during the Nuclear Security Summits. The first summit, proposed by President Obama in 2009 and held the following year in Washington, was known as the Global Nuclear Security Summit and called together world leaders from 47 countries for talks regarding the advancement of nuclear security and the responsibility of nations to maintain and enhance this security. In March of 2012, the second summit was held in Seoul, where participants renewed the commitments made in 2010 and again underscored the urgency of the issue. And to quote the Seoul communique, "We stress the fundamental responsibility of states, consistent with their respective national and international obligations, to maintain effective security of all nuclear material, which includes nuclear materials used in nuclear weapons and nuclear facilities under their control, and to prevent non-state actors from acquiring such materials and from obtaining information or technology required to use them for malicious purposes." So Bill S-9 brings us closer to the ratification of those 2 conventions and thus to the fulfillment of Canada's international obligations with regard to nuclear security. And given the importance of this legislation and the urgency, Mr. Speaker, of putting in place an international regime to counter nuclear terrorism, one wonders why this legislation has been 7 years in the making. International agreements aiming to prevent nuclear terrorism is not something we should take lightly, and our ratification has been delayed for far too long. This bill has the support of both sides of the House, and the lack of legislation thus far speaks more to the apathy on the government side rather than any threat of political interference or controversy. Mr. Speaker, Canada has long been a leader in the field of international cooperation, although that reputation has been tainted under this government, and we should maintain that reputation, Mr. Speaker, and for that reason we support this Bill S-9. Thank you.
Questions and